At long last, Donna is here to give you a presentation on the Dare County flood maps.
Good morning, Donna.
Good morning. Happy New Year. It's
Happy
been
New
quite
Year.
some time since I've been in front of you to talk about the flood maps, but I am pleased to start off the year by that discussion. The flood maps were released to Dare County on June the 30th, 2016, so by the time they become effective, it will be almost 4 years to the date. So although they are new flood maps, they're not really new to us. We've been talking about them for some time and trying to come up with a response to those maps, and I'd like to thank Mr. Overton for taking time out of his schedule today and coming and speaking at public comment. They have been involved in our process as well as the other local planners, and the comments that I make today are pertinent to unincorporated Dare County and the regulations that we enforce and administer. We oversee the unincorporated portions of the county, although the flood maps include the towns. The comments that I make this morning are particular to unincorporated Dare County. I do anticipate the towns will undertake similar procedures, but they will be reflective of their own particular situations. We did receive the letter of final determination, which is the final step or one of the final steps in the flood map process. The flood maps are developed by the state of North Carolina and FEMA with very little input from us, other than we process the procedures to get those adopted. That letter was dated December the 19th, 2019, and that starts a 6-month time clock for when those maps become effective. So based on that date, the maps will be effective on June 19th, 2020. June 19th, 2020. So in that 6-month time period, we have to start the procedures that will affect the adoption of the flood maps. If we do not do that, the flood maps become effective themselves. So we do want to be involved in those procedures. Those procedures involve certain notification of the public hearing process. We have to revise the Dare County Flood Development Prevention Ordinance, and for unincorporated Dare County, we have several zoning districts that use base flood as the building height reference point. So we will be making some amendments to a handful of zoning districts. And I'm sorry, I'm so involved in this. I haven't been in front of you guys in so long that I'm not even doing my PowerPoint presentation. So let me get caught up here. I apologize for that.
It's been since last year.
I know. The EMTs are nervous. I'm nervous anyway. As I said, there are certain procedures that we have to implement to adopt these flood maps and the revisions to the ordinance. Those procedures involve the planning board. The planning board has to make a formal recommendation on this. These procedures typically take 3 to 4 months, so we want to make sure that we have everything in order by the time June 19th rolls around, and so we want to start early on so that we're not caught short-sighted. Those procedures typically take 3 to 4 months due to the scope of the changes. Instead of the one public hearing that the Board of Commissioners will hold, we will be holding several public meetings with the stakeholders. We will have outreach activities stressing the importance of flood insurance. So there's a lot that we have to do in between now and June the 19th. So the maps are very different, as you heard Mr. Overton state. And just before I start getting into the nitty-gritty of the maps, I'm just wanting to take a step back. For those who aren't involved in what a flood map is and deal with it on a regular basis, we have flood zones on a flood map. The flood map is used for insurance rating purposes, and the flood ordinance is the construction and the regulatory end of it. On those flood maps, and the flood maps that we have now, they're all digital. They're all on the state's website that you have to go to and look up. And so they're not the print copies like we used to have in the old days. But on those flood maps you have, or Dare County is going to have 5 zones, but there's the AE zone, which is the typical flood zone, and that is indicative of the still water flooding, and that usually has a number associated with it that establishes your base flood. Then you have VE zones, which is the V stands for velocity, and that's wave action on top of the still water flooding, and those are typically along the ocean front. Then on the new maps, we have a great deal of what's called the shaded X zone, and the shaded X zone is your 0.2% annual chance of flooding. The AE is your 1% annual chance of flooding, and so There's the X zone, and then there's the shaded X zone, the AE zone, and the VE zone. So as I delve into this, if I use any terminology that you're not familiar with, please interrupt me so that I can explain that, because I get all excited about flood maps, and I forget that not everybody is as enthused as I am about it. So the flood maps. The current maps that we have are effective in 2006, and on those flood maps, in the AE zone, there's 12,875 properties. On the 2020 maps, those are going to be 8,493 properties in the AE zone. Those properties that are remaining in the AE zone, they're having their base flood elevations drop as well. So if you were in an AE zone now, you're transitioning to an AE zone on the 2020 maps, you're probably going to be in an AE4. The VE zones on the 2006 maps, we have 1,828 properties. On the 2020 maps, that number is dropping to 124 properties. The majority of those VE zones are transitioning to AE zones. On the 2020 maps, there's 2,890 properties that are being reclassified as a shaded X or an X zone. So not only are there a large number of properties that are being reclassified to a lower risk flood zone, the elevations in the properties that are remaining in a flood zone are also dropping. So those are the numbers for Dare County. This is a slide that the state provided us, and I don't know how well those numbers show up, but it just illustrates the changes that are occurring in the towns, and they are seeing similar numbers in terms of the properties that are transitioning to a shaded X or an X zone, or ones that are having their elevations dropped. So what are the impacts of the maps? When the revised maps become effective in June of 2020, they will be used for insurance rating purposes. So if you have a flood policy in effect now and it's renewed on or after June 19th, 2020, it will be based on those new maps. If you get a new flood policy on or after June 19th, it'll be based on those flood insurance maps. There is a potential for increased savings for property owners for their flood insurance, and so it is very important that property owners talk to their flood insurance agent in between now and the 19th to find out what impacts those new maps will have on their properties. But the most important thing I want to remind folks is if you have a flood insurance policy and you transition to an X zone, that you need to keep that flood insurance policy and talk to your insurance agent about how much money that's going to save you. So overall, the numbers that I just read to you, they represent a 41% decrease in the number of properties that are in a flood zone. The shaded X and the X zone properties do not require flood insurance if they are associated with a federally insured mortgage. And that's pretty significant. You just heard me talk about how the X zone or the shaded X zone is called the 500-year flood by a lot of folks, and the AE is referred to as a 100-year flood zone. And I'm going to tell you that those terms are very, very misleading, and I hope that we can stop using them as part of our phraseology. Just like we try not to use affordable housing, I want us to get away from using 100 and 500-year flood zones. Just to illustrate this point, we had Irene in 2011, we had Arthur in 2014, in 2016 we had Hermine, we had Matthew again in 2016, we had Michael in 2018, we had Dorian in 2019. So that's 6 events in 10 years. That's considerably less than 500 or 100 years. So that's when I say that those terms are misleading. They're very misleading, and that's one of the things that the outreach activities that we'll be conducting will be addressing. So the impacts of the maps, not only are the numbers of the changes significant, the areas where these numbers are changing are significant. The properties that are transitioning to shaded X and X zones in some instances have flooded, and they have repeatedly flooded.
Donna, could
Yes,
I just
sir.
ask one quick question
Yes, sir.
on that one? This is kind of related to the question I had sent you by email. I'm just trying to understand, and maybe there isn't a good explanation. You've very clearly laid out the storms we've had over the last 10 years.
Yes, sir.
Some of them very significant.
Yes, sir.
You've also explained the former reference of 500-year flood zone to shaded X and X. You've now clearly stated that many properties in the X and shaded X zone did flood, some repeatedly, and yet FEMA and the guidelines still have them as X.
Yes, sir.
It doesn't seem to make sense to me. And again, I'm not trying to derail your presentation to a lengthy
No, sir.
sidebar, but
No,
it
sir.
just, on the surface, it didn't make sense.
Well, and that ties into part of the recommendations that we're making today. The flood maps are developed by FEMA and by the state of North Carolina, and they're based on coastal flood models, computer flood models, and they have acknowledged that these flood models are somewhat out of date because they started running the flood models and developing these flood maps 7, 8 years ago, and so they're not necessarily reflective of the Matthews and the Dorians and all, and so that's the explanation that they offer to us.
So we'll use models that may be 8 years old, not up to date. We will not recognize current actual data, but here they are anyway.
That's why it's the recommendation that you're going to hear in just
I
a few
know.
minutes
I
of what
know.
we're doing. And so, you know, it's FEMA. That's
Yeah.
the best
Commissioner-
answer that I can give you,
I
yeah.
wasn't,
Commissioner, part of our correspondence and conversation, ongoing conversation over periods of time, we pointed out that they did not include the Matthew and the Hermine numbers with respect
Yes.
to flooding. But that fell on deaf ears, and that's where we had a lot of additional flooding.
I feel
we'll
that
take.
that captures it as best as you can. It fell on deaf ears.
Right.
And it's, anyway, please,
Donna,
Don,
I
thank
got
you.
a question. So, it's my understanding, they based these figures when they came up with these floodplains on Isabel.
Yes,
That's right.
But listen, Isabel was just like Irene. We got the same inundation of water in Hatteras, Kitty Hawk, Duck. So why wouldn't they take that in consideration when they looked at the maps and said, listen, we got 6 foot of water with
Right.
tidal surge in?
right. Well, when they're running the coastal flood models, they're running them for the entire state of North Carolina. And so some of the counties to the south of us, they experience new flood maps that go in the exact opposite direction of us because they did reflect Isabel and Floyd and those other storms. And so, again, it's a flaw in the coastal modeling, and North Carolina is bound by their agreement with the federal government to use the FEMA coastal modeling and not take advantage of some of the other modeling that may be available from the college systems or other third parties.
But Donna, even though, if I understand this correctly, even though, for insurance purposes, let's say, the new modeling can play to the benefit of the residents in the
Yes, sir.
county, we can still use common sense on our ordinances and regulations and building regulations to provide some semblance of common sense to the thing.
Yes, sir. And if you'll recall, in one of my previous presentations to the boards, we acknowledged that the maps represented an opportunity for flood insurance savings for property owners, but that we again acknowledged that there was a flaw in the modeling and that we were going to come in and identify some sort of regulatory framework that we could apply, that common sense approach, if you will.
And Wally, Don, I want to follow through on that as well. You know, things like on your waterfront properties with a lot of sound fronts we have and canal fronts down in Hatteras, things like hanging enclosures, they're not going to be impacted by this. This is strictly flood. These building ordinances are not impacted. Also, areas of environmental concern there where the decking and stuff goes, that stuff is not a part of this. That stays static. We would address that separately going forward.
Well, a lot of what you just talked about was camera regulations, the hanging enclosures, and again, that's a lot of how those are addressed are through the insurance underwriting, and we have no control over that. We will control through the flood ordinance where you elevate and what occurs underneath that area that's below the base flood. That's what the flood ordinance addresses. Anything else? Okay, so getting back to my presentation, With the change to the shaded X and the X zone, there's a concern that property owners will not fully realize the risk of their property based on a review of the flood insurance maps, and that as a result, they'll decide that their property is not at risk to flooding and they will drop or discontinue their flood insurance. This is particularly true for those folks that may be relocating to Dare County that have not been here to experience one of our flood events. And so they are going to look at the map and be advised by their mortgage professional that they don't need to get flood insurance because the federal government doesn't require that. And our goal is to try to educate those folks to understand that just because the flood map shows that you're in an X zone or a shaded X zone, that you do have a risk to flooding, that flood zones floods can happen anywhere, anytime. 25% of the flood claims that are filed happen in X zone properties. There's also another concern that where we update the flood maps or where FEMA updates the flood maps every 10 years or so, that there will be a bounce back effect, and that the next time the flood maps are updated, that will revert back to these higher elevations or to a higher elevation, and that will result in non-conforming structures and also an increase in flood insurance rates. I'm just going to go through some of these more significant changes of the maps just to illustrate our concerns. So here you have a smaller version of the 2006 map for the oceanfront in Avon Village. This is Ocean View Drive. Ocean View Drive has experienced extensive flooding the past couple of months. There on the 2006 maps, there's a VE zone, which is the green zone. The blue zone is the AE zone and AE8. The map on the right-hand side is the 2020 map. You'll see that Ocean View Drive is transitioning to a shaded X, the yellow zone, or just the non-colored zone or the aerial zone there is an X zone. So again, it's the significance of the areas that are changing, not just the numbers. Hatteras Village, the map up at the top corner is the 2006 map. The oceanfront there in Hatteras Village, the green, it's the VE zone. The blue zone is the village area. That's an AE8 or an AE9. The bottom corner is the 2020 map. You'll see that there is a large area of shaded X zone along the oceanfront. That's the area of Hurricane Isabel that got a substantial flooding in Hurricane Isabel. The village that's remaining in an AE zone, those elevations are dropping to 3 and 4 feet there in Hatteras Village. Here's Kylington. This is Kylington Harbor. You'll see the upper left-hand corner is all the canals there in Kylington Harbor. Those are an AE8 zone now on the 2006 maps. On the 2020 maps, those areas are transitioning predominantly to a shaded X zone. The areas that are remaining in the flood zone are an AE4. So a lot of those people that live on elevated structures have ground floor enclosures that are below base flood now, that are limited by law to parking access and storage, and there's a concern that those folks are going to try to convert those ground floor enclosures and be at risk to flood damages. Yes, sir.
So if I'm understanding that diagram or that photo elevation on Collington, in the previous 06 map, it was an AE8 throughout most of Collington, which would imply 8 foot above base flood. Have I got that right?
When you measure base flood, you factor in what your natural grade is. So if your natural grade is 4 feet and there is a base flood of 8 feet, your first floor of living area has to be 2 or above 8 feet. So you compensate for that difference between the ground level and what the map says you have to be. So.
And the new designation as, what was it, shaded X, I think it was?
Yes, sir. It's a shaded X, which means that there are no elevation standards according to the flood maps.
Build on the ground.
You can build slab on grade, and the grade levels there in Kylington are pretty low, 4 feet. Yeah.
Wow.
I know.
I just wanted to make sure I was understanding that.
Right. Well, no, that's the same reaction we've had, you know, 4 years ago when we got these maps, yeah.
Last week getting ready, and I thought, no, I'm misreading that somehow.
Donna's lost her mind. No, Donna has not, no. No, that's the same reaction that we've had, yeah.
Donna, while they're getting you up, let me ask you this. If you're an insurance person, are you happy about this or are you sad about this?
What I've heard from the insurance people is that they're alarmed by the changes in the maps. We've had meetings with, I had a meeting back this summer with a lot of the mortgage professionals and the insurance professionals, and they are sharing the same concerns as us because they have the empirical knowledge just like we do based on their flood claims of where the floods occur. And you know, people like to save money, but there's not the opportunity to save money shouldn't come through your flood insurance policy just based on these maps here. Currituck County's maps have already been adopted, and what's happening up there is that the properties that are transitioning to the X and the X zones, that the mortgage companies are sending letters to property owners saying, we've canceled your flood insurance because you're no longer in a flood zone. And so we got to try to address that, and that's one of the challenges that we have with our outreach activities. So the guys that got me back up here's Collington, and so what is the recommended response that we have to these maps? So currently in the VE zones, which are generally along the ocean front, we have a 1-foot freeboard that's in effect now. That the freeboard locally, Dare County adopted a 1-foot freeboard in 2014. We're not recommending any change to the VE zones in the terms of freeboard. In the AE zones and the AO zones, we're recommending a 3-foot freeboard above base flood elevation or elevation to a local elevation standard, what we're calling the LES. In the shaded X and the X zones, we're recommending that you be elevated to this local elevation standard, and the number that we have identified for the local elevation standard is 8 feet. This 8-foot number has been tossed around for several months, and it's based on input from the stakeholders, as well as a lot of study of maps and historical firms that we have. Why 8 feet? And so that's the question, and we've tossed around, is 8 feet enough? Is 8 feet too much? And so early on, we went back and we sought input from the surveying community who are out in the field every day and know the topography of Dare County. And their input indicates to us that 8 feet is the appropriate number. One of our goals is to stay similar to the 2006 maps, and so AE8 is what's predominant on the 2006 maps. Plus, we also have a very extensive knowledge of what floods and where it floods and how high the floods are. And so that's factored into all of that.
Don, just one quick question
Yes,
on
sir.
that too. AE8, I accept that that's a good number. If I'm sitting here saying, you know what, I think it should be AE10, I think it should be 10 feet, in fact. Is there a cost/construction, engineering, et cetera, issue related to going from 8 to 10 or 8 to some higher number?
Yes, sir, there is a cost associated with that. And when you build in Dare County, you have to address the flood, so you have to build up. But then you also have to address wind, and there's a certain point that the engineers will tell you that if you go up too high, then you expose yourself to more wind. So trying to find that number and whether 8 is the correct number, we're using historical knowledge and empirical knowledge of flooding, but as Mr. Overton said, that's a minimum standard, and you can always elect to go up a couple more feet, and people do that now. They choose to do that now. So one of the things that we first did, and they've lost, there we go. One of the things that we looked at several months ago was the historical flood maps. The first flood maps for Dare County were adopted in 1978. And those flood maps simply determined A zones and V zones. There were no base flood elevations. In 1986, the flood maps were revised, and they did establish base flood elevations. And you'll see the predominant number there is an AE8. I've listed all of the flood zones that applied in all of the different villages in Dare County. The same thing for 1993. Predominant was AE8. On the 2006 maps, again, the predominant flood zone is an AE8. The right-hand column has all of the flood zones on the 2020 maps listed, and you'll note that every village there in unincorporated Dare County has shaded X included in it. So again, predominant elevation is AE8, and our goal was to remain consistent with the 2006 because We know from our empirical knowledge that those structures that were elevated to the 2006 levels when Hurricane Irene rolled through, that folks had flooding in their ground floor enclosures, but the ones that were elevated to the 06 maps and the previous elevated maps, that their living areas were generally not impacted. So, how will the LES work? How will this local elevation standard work? The idea is to treat the shaded X and the X zones as if they were still in the flood zone. Your first floor of living area, where you have your heated and conditioned space, would have to be elevated to this regulatory flood level. You could not have any heated space below that 8-foot mark. It would be restricted to parking, access, and storage, just like if you were in an AE zone now. We measure that at the bottom of the lowest floor, so the construction standards are everything below, everything here to this mark has to be heated and conditioned space. Your utilities, your ductwork cannot be below that regulatory flood elevation mark. And you would also have to have flood vents beneath, in the areas that were the ground floor enclosure that were below that mark, and you would have to submit an elevation certificate, again, as if you were building in the AE zone.
That's good. It's good stuff.
So I'm just going to go through, and I know this is lengthy, but I think it's important just to get to the basis of this, some examples of how this LES would affect construction. If you have a property that's in an AE zone, you'd have a 3-foot freeboard or to 8 feet, whichever is higher. So if you're in an AE6 zone on the 2020 maps, you're going to have a 3-foot of freeboard applied because that's going to get you to 9 feet. If you're in an AE4 zone, 3 feet of freeboard's only going to get you to 7 feet, so we're going to kick in that local elevation standard and say you got to build to 8 feet. So 8 feet is the magic number. Anything below that would be restricted to parking, access, and storage because it's in the flood zone, and that's regulated by the federal flood laws. In the shaded X zone, the 8 feet factors into your natural grade, and that determines whether the local elevation standards will apply or if you don't have to deal with the local elevation standards. So if your natural grade is 5 feet and you come in to build a new house, we're going to tell you you have to elevate your first floor of living area to 8 feet. If your natural grade is 9 feet, then none of those standards are going to apply, and you don't have to deal with that level of regulatory framework. The existing structures in the shaded X and the X zone, we spent a great deal of time talking about how existing structures will be affected by the local elevation standard. Ground floor enclosures in shaded X and X zones could not be converted to living area unless they could maintain that 8-foot mark. If you go to build on to your existing structure to build a lateral addition, increase your footprint, then you could build at the time, whatever your floor level is at the time of your original construction. And if you remodel, then we would allow you to build at that level too. The distinction there is that the shaded X and the X are being affected by a local standard that we can control. How you build onto existing structures in an AE zone or a VE zone is affected by the federal rules, and we can't change that. So, what happens now? The board will give instructions to the planning director to proceed forward with our implementation procedures and move forward with the local elevation standard. We will implement our outreach activities for the revised flood maps and the revised flood ordinance with the goal of coming back to the Board of Commissioners in April of 2020 with a formal recommendation so that we can get everything, schedule a public hearing and have everything adopted well before June the 19th. I'll stop right there. Yes, sir.
Do we expect on those X and shaded X zones especially, any kind of pushback from people in the neighborhoods about, geez, what are you guys doing with this local elevation standard at 8 feet and so on?
There very well may be pushback. That's why we're going to have all these public meetings to see. I think, as we all know, that there's an inherent flaw in the flood maps, or at least from the planning standpoint and from the stakeholder standpoint. And so we want to protect individuals so that their flood risk, that they realize what their true flood risks are. We don't want to have that bounce back effect 5-10 years from now when the flood maps change. And so that's what the procedures will be. And I think we have good answers when we do get that pushback of why we're doing this.
Last question. 500 homeowners now in X and shaded X in the new maps cancel flood insurance. We get another Matthew. 500 homes are flooded, no insurance. What happens?
They don't get paid.
Yep.
No insurance. You don't have insurance. You know?
Also, Rocky Ronson Road down in Buxton, there's don't be lulled into a false sense of security because those shaded X zones flooded
Yep,
with Dory.
absolutely.
I got one question.
Yeah.
I get it if we're going from like an AE to an X, we're gonna impose these standards. Suppose I'm an X today. I'm an X zone right now and the flood change maps don't affect me at all and I've got a vacant lot. When I come in to build on my X after we adopt this ordinance, do I now have to go to 8 feet like everybody else, even though the flood maps didn't change me any?
Yes, sir, but in concept, those properties that are already in the X zone are more than likely, their natural grade is above 8 feet. We have had GIS department do elevation maps for us and all, and so we've studied that. I can't give you an exact number.
If that's true, we won't have pushback, but if you're in, that's where the pushback would come from. If I'm now in an X and I could build on slab,
Right.
and the flood maps didn't change, I'm still X before and after, but now I have to raise.
Yeah.
That's,
See, I believe the
Most of the-
existing
most
six
of-
maps,
right.
X, were okay.
Right,
It's the change from AE to X now in the
Yes,
new
sir.
maps that are
but if
bringing the
most of
problem.
those properties are already above
Yes.
base flood, then it won't be a problem.
That's
Most of
existing,
the
those
X
six maps,
zones
yes,
on the
that'd be no problem.
2006 maps are on the north end of Roanoke Island. Some are in Buxton, there's a handful in Kylington, and those elevations are already above 8 feet. So they're not going to be impacted by that. We did factor that into all of our discussions. It's these areas that are the new X and the shaded X there along the ocean front in Avon and Kylington Harbor. It's very rare to find 8 feet of elevation in Kylington Harbor.
Right.
When we started this discussion 2 years ago,
2016.
Yeah.
3 years ago, then the goal was how do we maintain the status quo? How do we sort of grandfather in the current elevations? Because we thought 2006 elevations were okay.
Yep.
And the question was, how do you do that? And that's the conversation for the last 3 or 4 years that Don has been having with the user groups and the community and all that to come up with these recommendations that they're about to give you. Is it perfect? Probably not, but as best you can get to that goal, I think this accomplishes that.
Yes, sir, we hope so.
I think the more education, and we're doing a good job. I attended the meeting that was here with the stakeholders right in this very room. And that communication and that information that's going out to the people who are going to be impacted by these is going to help them make the right common sense decision. We're not we're not being lackadaisical about this. We're putting the information out there, and any mistake that is made on behalf of a homeowner is going to be on them.
And I just want to point out, the public information radio spot you have out is excellent.
Yep.
It definitely covers it and it gets the word out. Also, I was also kind of pondering, especially when you mentioned new people moving into Dare County is not familiar with the county and the flooding situation. Have we reached out to a board of realtors to let the realtors know that they really need to educate their
Yes, sir, that's one of the stakeholder groups that we'll be meeting with, and the Board of Realtors, the executive officers, they've been involved in this process as a user group all along. And so I had a community meeting scheduled with them the week after Hurricane Dorian, and so we canceled that, but that's one of the first groups that I'll be meeting with. But they've been getting this information, and so we've brought them into the fold. Yes, sir.
Thank you.
Donna, are the flood insurance rates going to be based on the freeboard that we're adding or the existing rates that come down to us?
Flood insurance rates are based on what's on the map.
That's right.
But the greater your separation of your first floor of living area is from that base flood, your flood insurance rate reflects that. And there's lots and lots of things that go into the determination of your flood insurance rate, but the local freeboard is not the base that the insurance agent uses. It's what's on that flood map.
So just for clarity, someone's at a 8-foot now, the rate drops to a 6-foot. We have a 6-foot plus a 2-foot freeboard. They're basing it on the 6-foot map cost. And because you're 2 foot above, your flood rate's probably gonna be a lot less than they were before because of the fact that you have the 2-foot freeboard.
It should be. That's why it's important for folks to have a conversation with their insurance agent, because what the insurance agents have told me, or if you're in an AE zone now and you transition to an X zone, that it may be better for you to keep your AE zone policy versus an X zone policy. So there's all kinds of details in there that the insurance agents are the experts on, and not myself. All I know to tell them is you need to talk to them, because there's an opportunity there for you, and you don't want to miss that savings, but you also don't want to leave yourself wide open to a flood risk and cancel your flood insurance.
And you, that same scenario, my house is in an AE, it's gonna go to an X. I'm gonna keep my AE and keep paying the AE rate, because I know that when they come back and do the maps again, I'm gonna go back to AE. If I go down and buy it at an X rate or cancel it, then I'm gonna be paying the non-subsidized rate when I go back and have to get it for my new AE, whereas if I keep paying, I'm grandfathered in at the low rate.
What would happen in a situation like that would be, your flood changes, and by the way, your rate is based on that elevation certificate that engineer goes out and does. There's a base elevation, first floor elevation, all of those numbers are factored into what your rate is gonna be and how much premium you pay. If in fact you did change that and didn't continue to pay an AE rate and you're in an X, you have a loss, and you're in that new zone and you're that rate. If you have a loss, they will go back and look at that and adjust that rate before they pay that loss. They'll make you pay that difference. And they'll pay the loss, but you'll have to pay the difference in order for them to
The difference in the coverage.
difference in the coverage.
That's why the elevation certificate.
That's
is
why it's
important.
so
Go ahead
critical.
and get one.
That's-
Yes.
And let me tell you, I do this every day, and no disrespect to those that are doing it, those engineers out there, but you have got to watch that. I mean, you have got to watch that and make sure that certificate is correct and accurate, because I have found in way too many instances that they're not always correct. And you need to challenge that as a consumer to make sure that that is correct before that's submitted to
Freshen it
your
up, if
carrier.
anything else, spring for another one to get
Right.
it freshened.
And they're not, and of course, they're not cheap. They're costly to have those done.
Yes, but you can sometimes recoup that cost pretty quickly in the savings on your
That's
flood
exactly
insurance.
right.
Yes, sir.
That's exactly right.
And so if the board would just formally say, Donna, go do what you got to do, we're good with the LES standards, we think that that's worth investigating, I would greatly appreciate that, just so the record will
Do
reflect
you
that.
need a motion for us to instruct you?
A motion, yes, sir. I think I included a motion
Yeah.
in the packet.
We need a motion to instruct staff to proceed with map adoption and updates to the flood ordinances to include consideration of local elevation standards.
So move.
There's a motion by Vice Chairman and Commissioner Bateman. Is there a second?
Second.
It's seconded by Commissioner House. Any further discussion? Hearing none. Those in favor of that motion signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed, like sign. Motion carries unanimous.
Thank you so much.
Donna, thank you. And also Jay, thank you, the home builders and the realtors and our stakeholders for being a part of this. It's critical that we have that input, especially from our home builders, with respects to where we move forward. And thank you for being a part of that, Jay.